was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta is a special city, a very complex place. Culturally, historically, in terms of population, it is considered to be the Black Mecca of the South, at the very least. It's a place where Black excellence cropped up and has remained present and visible for many, many years. Obviously, it was the cradle of the civil rights movement for a time, and Martin Luther King and John Lewis and lots of important figures were doing really incredible work in Atlanta. I myself come from a family that was involved in the civil rights movement. And so I have family members that were doctors, who were lawyers, who were entrepreneurs in Atlanta at a time when that level of achievement for Black people was like unheard of. Unheard of. It was not a thing that was really possible everywhere. But in Atlanta, it was happening. Despite the fact that I come from such rich history, I didn't know most of what I just said to you. I didn't know most of that until I was a teenager. My parents, they didn't talk to me about the world, really. Like, they didn't explain anything to me about the country we lived in or other countries around the world. They didn't talk to me about race or racism or, they didn't give me any stereotypes about other people to carry around. They just didn't do any of that. And they sort of left me on my own to make my own conclusions about the world. And on the one hand, I love that. The worldview I have, the things I believe, like I'm really certain that I believe them, because I know I developed these ideas by myself. Nobody was like indoctrinating me into the way of whatever. When it comes to music, when it comes to films, television, and things like that, I've had to learn, find, read, research all on my own. But one thing I did really understand clearly as a kid, even though I didn't understand big topics like culture or, other things like that, I did recognize that there were boxes. I did recognize that the world seemed to be full of boxes. I could tell when I was in spaces with other people that there was perhaps like a script that everyone else seemed to be following, like a script everyone had read, they understood it, they got it. And I felt like the only person who had never seen the script before and had no idea. I remember being like in elementary school and already I was starting to see the segregation that exists in the South. And I mean, maybe in other places too, but I can tell you as somebody who went to lots of different schools in the South, in Georgia in particular, that there's this thing that would happen where you go into the cafeteria and you look around and all of the kids are segregated by race. Nobody said only white kids can sit together or only Black kids could sit together. But in most of the cafeterias that I grew up in, there was complete like self-segregation. Now, I don't know what that's about. I don't know what's happening at home that kids are at school, even that young, elementary, middle school, thinking that they can only connect with people who look like them. But that's something that I fundamentally missed. So I didn't pick up that there were, that there's tension, that racial tension exists. So when I was in elementary school, I could see very clearly, like all the white kids were together by themselves and all the Black kids were together by themselves. And I could tell that all of those people in both groups had a connection to each other that was missing between me and them. And what I was picking up on, which I know now, but I did not know then, was that I was looking at whiteness from the outside and I was looking at Blackness as it existed in my community then from the outside. Yeah. And I could tell that these were two different boxes, and that to fit in the box, there were requirements. The requirements to fit in the box where you had to understand the lingo, the references, the catchphrases, and you had to understand like what was culturally important to these groups at the time. Like you had to be watching the television shows these kids were watching. You had to be listening to the music these kids were listening to. And if those things weren't happening, like you could not pass the test, you could not fit in the box. So I would try to engage with the white kids and they were listening to stuff like the Beatles and Cake and Bread and whatever. And I was like, who? Never heard of any of these bands, and they were immediately like, oh, she doesn't fit the box whatsoever. And then I would go to the Black kids and I would try to hang out with them. And they were talking about like TLC and Beyonce and all these bands. And I was like, who? And they were like, nope, she's weird. Can't tell you who it is. So I was always outside of boxes. I was along the margin. I was in between group all the time as a child, and I could never figure out like what that was. I could tell right from the beginning I was very different from people around me, but it took many years and lots of studying and many different subjects for me to learn enough about myself and about how the world works to realize the many factors that go into that. Yeah, so many things go into to not fitting inside the box. But for this reason, by the time I was in middle school, I had this idea that there was no way I was going to survive into adulthood. And the reason why I thought that was because I'd already looked around at the adult. I'm an only child, by the way. So aside from like spending time with my cousins when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time by myself and I spent a lot of time around adults. And I was a really mature and precocious child. I was a child prodigy in some ways. So I was like hearing conversations, following things that adults were going through that, like, a kid shouldn't be listening to. I was like watching things that had adults, and I was watching a lot of stuff. So I'd already made conclusions about adulthood, even as young as, 11 or 12. And I decided that it seemed to me that being an adult was all about fitting in. It was all about fitting into boxes, meeting expectations, being able to tell people what they wanted to hear. Like I was like, wow, okay, so to be an adult, you have to be able to fit in. You have to be able to follow instructions. You have to be a good follower. You have to be able to do all this stuff that I was terrible at as a kid. I was a terrible follower. I wasn't into peer pressure or shit like that. I was always in my own little world doing my own Reagan stuff. And so I felt convinced, like, oh, there's no way I'm going to make it as an adult, because you have to be able to fit in to do that. You have to be able to fit this box. And I don't fit boxes. I've never fit any boxes. I didn't know I was non-binary as a kid because honestly, the term non-binary had just come out like in the decade previously, and it was like not widely used. And honestly, there was no education. There was no discussion anywhere that I can remember as a child where people were talking to you about gender and sexuality issues whatsoever. So I had no idea. Obviously, I was assigned female at birth. And as a kid, I just learned the script of what it means to be a girl. And I tried to be a girl as best as I could. But, I'm not all female, so it didn't work out that well. I naturally gravitated a lot toward boys, but boys always had interesting reactions to me, because on the one hand, they might have been able to sense the maleness of my particular non-binary smoothie, and they were kind of like, safe. But on the other hand, the packaging is assigned at female at birth, so social dynamics were really challenging for that reason. And it was tricky. I spent a lot of my life trying to pass, I could tell that there were just there are eligibility requirements for things in life, and then there was the box. And the box often was not indicative of the eligibility requirements. The box is just this small, arbitrary, gatekeeper thing that prevents people who are eligible to do something from actually doing it or actually being acceptable as they do it. That's what I sort of learned through all of it. It was to be a girl, you just have to be born with this part of your body. That's how it seemed. You're just assigned female at birth. If you're born with a pussy, then here you go. You're a girl. And then the box of what a girl is supposed to be is tons of other shit that has absolutely nothing to do with the gender of womanhood. The box is you're supposed to like pink and play with Barbies and like to dress stuff up and do easy bake oven shit. And you're supposed to wear dresses and you're supposed to idolize other women and you're supposed to be into rom-coms and falling in love and getting married is supposed to be the trajectory of your life. That's supposed to be the most important thing to you. That's the box for girls. For women, you're supposed to fit into this box. You are supposed to follow the rules of this box, And it's the same with men. To be a man, to be a guy, the eligibility requirement is were you born with a dick? Okay. But then the box of what it means to be a guy is it's more prescriptive than just having a dick. You're supposed to be masculine. You're supposed to be male, which is another way of saying you're just not supposed to be anything like a girl. You're not supposed to like stuff. You're not supposed to get too excited. You're not supposed to be too fashionable. You're not supposed to be too flamboyant. You aren't supposed to like this or that. You're supposed to be into trucks and dirty stuff like mud and hunting and fishing. There's there's a script. There's a box, It shouldn't be that complicated, but there's a box for everything. It seemed like there was a box. And so what did I do? Growing up as a little weird non-binary kid who didn't have any box privilege, right? I call it box privilege because there are people who naturally do fit inside the box, There are people who do naturally like the things that they're supposed to like. Who just easily fit into what it means to satisfy the requirements of this small, arbitrary frame, But if you're not like that, if you don't fit the box at all, then you don't have that privilege. You don't have the privilege of the box is shaped for you. Before you showed up, the box was shaped so that you would be able to fit. Usually it's not that way. It doesn't happen. So why does all of this matter? All of this matters because life outside of the box is where life actually happens. I think that spending time and energy and just like psychological currency on trying to fit into a small space, on trying to fit a mold, to meet expectations that have been set by people you don't know, you probably wouldn't even like, people you don't even agree with. I think that is something that takes over our lives a lot of the time. I think it's the thing that steers us off course so much of the time. And then for me, I feel like I've gotten most of the box out. I've got all this free space. And I thought, wouldn't it be so amazing if I could make an online space for this process, this conversation about what it's like to live in between worlds, what it's like to be outside the box all the time. What is it like to live on the margins of these experiences? Because that's where I've always lived. That's where I've always been. And so in between worlds is where I want to document all of that. The conversations that I have here are going to be interdisciplinary. They're going to cross borders and boundaries. They're going to cross countries, cultures, languages. The purpose of this series really is to just exist fully and be visible fully in my own intersectionality and to invite that of everybody who stops by. I think we all need more places where we can just be everything. We don't have to be this or that. We can be this and that. We can be all of it, all together, all at once. I feel like that's how we all naturally exist anyway.